Welcome to this Taxcast Extra from the Tax Justice Network with me, Naomi Fowler. You can listen to our monthly Taxcasts by going to www.taxjustice.net/Taxcast. And we're also on iTunes, Stitcher and various other podcast platforms. Today I'm talking to economist Henry Leveson-Gower, Chief Executive of Promoting Economic Pluralism and Editorial Director of The Mint magazine. Promoting Economic Pluralism works to support better policy to tackle economic, social and environmental challenges, including a new accreditation system for pluralist economics courses. They've teamed up with many other organisations, including the Tax Justice Network, to put on a series of events 10 years after the financial crisis to challenge and discuss the outdated economic thinking that got us into such a mess. Here's that conversation with Henry Leveson-Gower.
Let's start with a pluralist approach to understanding the economy. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's an approach that starts with the issue or problem or the system you want to understand, and then explores what sort of methods or models or ways of understanding are most appropriate or useful. And that may be, a number. So, for instance, if you're looking at a system that over a long term, you're interested in quite big interacting systems and what to do for long-term goals, you probably want methods that allow you to take into account the changes of institutions, interactions, substantial change. On the other hand, if you're looking at a sort of short-term change where most things are staying the same, where maybe the people involved are acting in a fairly sort of standard sort of fashion, then maybe another method might be more appropriate. And to some extent, the question of cost and effort come into it. So neoclassical economics, for instance, is quite cheap and easy to do. The models are well developed. The assumptions are very easy to use. You don't need a lot of data. So for short-term changes in incentives, changing in regulations, that might be the most practical way of doing it. However, if you're looking at sort of big questions over the long term, like, for instance, what are the impacts of Brexit, then to try to understand that with models that have a very static, require everything else to stay the same, basically, would seem to lead to very unrealistic conclusions. Because obviously we have lots of different systems. We're changing, but Europe may be changing. Trade policy around the world is changing. There are lots of potential other scenarios. You've got a very complex system. So modelling that's very static, that assumes a lot of things stay the same, is very unlikely to produce anything sensible.
Right, okay, and you say that using this more pluralist approach would have helped policymakers to better understand the 2007-2008 crash and maybe to even have avoided it. I wonder if you can paint a picture for me on what you mean.
That's a more challenging question. But at a very sort of basic level, the models and the way of seeing the economy had this underlying idea that markets always cleared, always moved towards equilibrium, and so that the prices always moved to get things back in place. And in that sort of world, crashes or crises are actually impossible. So it's important to realise that when the Queen asked the economists why didn't they see it coming, some people respond and say, well, you couldn't have predicted it. Of course, it's a bit like an earthquake. No one can predict an earthquake because it's so complex that you never know when an earthquake is actually going to happen. But what you can see is that pressure is building and the signs are an earthquake might happen soon. Now, in a similar sort of way, seeing the crash coming involved being able to understand what the signs were, what the building pressures were and so forth, which required you to at least be able to represent and imagine a crash. And this is not actually possible within the sort of modelling framework, within the conceptual framework that mainstream neoclassical economics has. The other thing is that neoclassical economics did not, at the time, the models did not include any picture of the financial sector. Money was seen as a neutral form of exchange, and the sort of financial economy was not considered relevant in models at all. So, firstly, a lot of other ways of thinking about the economy can model, can envisage crises, typically complexity economics, institutional economics, evolutionary economics, just about every other way of seeing the economy understands the economy in terms of potentially crowd behavior, dynamics that interact, can lead to crashes, booms and busts, and so on. So if the majority of economists were aware and had training in that area and could see the economy from that perspective, then one might have assumed they might have seen the pressures building. They may not have predicted when and if it happened, but they could have seen the pressures and possibly worked out what action to take to do something about that. And models such as agent-based modeling allow you to picture, represent the sort of dynamics that I'm talking about, and also allow you to put in different scenarios, different policy interventions, and see what happens as a result. Now, of course, I'm not saying that definitely they would have done anything about it, and obviously there was a lot going on, a lot of pressure to believe that everything would be okay. But there was no counterforce of substantial influence to put the contrary story, because the people who thought in that way were considered marginal and had no status.
Right. And because this sort of model that we have had for decades, we've kind of got stuck in a rut with all this in terms of economic thinking. You're talking about transformation. Do you see signs of that transformation in economic thinking happening? Are we moving away from this outdated model, and are we adapting to new realities, do you think?
I think the short answer at the moment is no. I think the economics profession is still totally dominated by neoclassical thinking frameworks of optimization, rationality, and so on. There's been movements around the edges to try and incorporate things like the finance sector into that model. Also, there has been behavioral economics has a level of traction, and that obviously allows for crowd behavior, for so-called irrationality. But there has been very little integration between behavioral economics and the rest of neoclassical economics, mainstream economics, basically because it doesn't fit really together very well. And behavioral economics isn't taught a huge amount, and mainstream economic courses generally don't involve it. So I think you have to look at the economics profession, academics and consultants and people who work in companies as part of an institution, a club, if you like. And there are certain rules to belonging to that club. And one is that you subscribe to these basic tenets of optimization, rationality, and so on. And you don't really go outside them as a general rule if you want to stay part of that club. And that club is very powerful. It controls employment, promotion, status, who gets into the big, important magazines. So if you want to do well at the moment, I think that the general rule is you stick in the club. If you start breaking away, you could be excommunicated, effectively, and no longer accepted.
Wow, that's pretty depressing.
Well, yes, no. I think you have to think that quite often, the thing that always I remember to give me hope was that on the day before the French Revolution, that was the day when the Ancien regime was at its strongest, was at its most well-developed, its most impregnable. And actually institutions that are threatened quite often become more defensive, more insular, and seemingly, on the face of it, more powerful before they actually fall to bits. And I think at the moment there is a lot of change happening, there's a lot of instability, and that, in Dickens' terms, is both possibly the worst of times, but also possibly the best of times. So it is a time for positive change, a time when things can move. So I think you can be optimistic.
Oh, I do agree. I do agree. And I'm just thinking so many people don't feel they have any specialism in this area, really been left out of the conversation for such a long time about anything to do with economics, finance, and it's such a specialised language that tends to be used. I'm just wondering, because you do need everybody to take their place in this debate, don't you? How do you bring all those people in from the cold?
Yeah, I think there is the perception, two key perceptions of economics. One, yes, that it's technical, impossible to understand. And secondly, actually, it's very dull. So most people don't want anything to do with it. And actually, if you've done a short course at university, that perception of dullness is certainly reinforced. So I think dullness is one of the strengths of mainstream economics because it puts everyone off it so that no one looks at it too closely. But it's also their weakness. And I think a more pluralist approach and other streams of thinking, ways of thinking in economics is much more interesting. Lends itself to much better stories, much richer pictures of the world and life, and people can see themselves a lot better in it. The problem is that mainstream economics is so well entrenched, and if you start talking about economics in a different way, and this at a dinner party conversation, someone said to me, but that's not economics. I said, well, yes, it actually is. It's institutional economics. And I said, oh, well, no, that's not what I think economics is. And I think The Economist, in particular, has been part of this in producing a very specific idea of what economics is. And it's obviously got a huge brand presence. So how do you counteract that? Well, I think you have to use the strengths of the fact that this area can be interesting, can be fun, you can tell good stories, you can be more interactive in the way you do things. For instance, on the 14th of September, on our 10 years after event, we have two interactive sort of improvisational events that are about people really empathizing, understanding what economies might look like from the viewpoint of the people who are actually within them. And I think we have to recognize that actually economics is as much about empathy, creativity, imagination as it is about analysis. This is, of course, a big task, but our magazine, The Mint, the fundamental sort of underlying idea is to try and do that, to make economics engaging, exciting, interesting, to pull people in and say, well, actually, hey, I can engage, I can sort of understand this. And I think the good thing is that because neoclassical economics, non-mainstream economics has been so neglected, most economists know very little about it. So if you come in as a non-economist and get involved in outside the mainstream, you will probably soon know as much or more, possibly a lot more, about pluralist economics than any of the mainstream economists. The student-led organisation that came out of Rethinking Economics is doing a lot of good work on this area as well, to engage and to bring in people to thinking about economics. Also, the RSA did work with their Citizens Economic Council.
What are you hoping that is going to happen as a result of all these events that you're putting on? And it's almost like a movement, really, a reform movement, it seems to me.
Well, I think you're right. I see it as a social movement, ultimately, along similar lines to the feminist movement, the gay movement, to the transgender movement. Because what it is ultimately about is changing how we think, the language we use, the way we understand the world. And the first stage is actually understanding that our language, our thought, our imagination has been constrained and narrowed and limited by the framework that has been so dominant for the last 30 years. That we use the language of incentives, win-win, maximizing returns. We have taken on the whole story narrative of mainstream economics. It's not just an analytical thing that happens behind closed doors in universities. It's actually gone out and taken over the way the world is seen. And people have become totally used to it. It's just the way we think. And so first we have to realize how it is constraining our thinking, how it means that someone like Trump can stand up and say, smart people don't pay tax. And people can think that that is actually a reasonable statement to make. So we have to actually escape from that and then start forging new languages, new images, new ways of seeing the world that can actually allow us to create a fairer, more sustainable and more resilient economic system. It's a pretty big ask, but only by bringing people together, by everyone working together and building a community and building an understanding of how we all need to change. This is personal as well as political. Can we actually get to where I think we need to be?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like a straitjacket we've all been in, but we didn't know we were in it.
We have to recognise we're in a straitjacket because it's an invisible straitjacket. We have to recognise it and then we have to break out of it.
You've been listening to a Taxcast Extra from the Tax Justice Network. For more information on promoting economic pluralism, go to www.economicpluralism.org. And for more information on the 10 Years After initiative, go to www.10yearsafterthecrash.com. That's 10 in numbers, not letters. To listen to the Taxcast, our monthly Tax Justice Network podcast, go to www.taxjustice.net/Taxcast. Thanks for listening.